If you've been following the viral post from a U.S. attorney, you know that the conversation is getting louder and more intense. The post accuses an Indian CEO of taking over a company, pushing out its original founders and filling the top leadership positions with a predominantly Indian team. The reaction, a mix of frustration, confusion, and accusations of biased hiring practices and mismanagement. So, what does this all mean for us? As working-class Americans, how strong is your company's culture? Is your workplace truly inclusive, or are we just putting on a facade? Are biased hiring practices threatening diversity in your organization? And let's get real. Can a company claim to be inclusive while still practicing biased hiring? Fellow Americans, are we really making progress in this battle for inclusion and diversity, or are we just pretending? Let's take a hard look at what's really going on. Today, we'll dig into how corporate culture is shaping the future of equity and inclusion, particularly in the tech sector. We'll explore the complex issues surrounding corporate governance, the surge of Indian immigrants in the workforce, and how all of this intersects with diversity in the workplace. So, grab your headphones and let's get into it.
Welcome to Curiosity Made Me podcast with Sam and Alex. So, you know how sometimes there's a story that just blows up online, everyone's talking about it. Well,
right.
That's kind of what happened with this situation involving an American attorney who's making some pretty serious accusations against an Indian CEO in the tech world. It sparked this whole debate about H-1B visas, workplace equity, and what it all means for American tech. And what's really fascinating to me is how this one story has tapped into all these anxieties people have about globalization and the changing workplace.
Yeah, it's definitely a lightning rod issue, and it brings up some really important questions about how we navigate a globalized workforce in the 21st century.
Right.
Yeah.
So to get everyone on the same page, let's start with the basics. This all revolves around the H-1B visa program. Can you give us a quick rundown of what that is and why it matters in this context?
Sure. So the H-1B visa program is designed to allow U.S. companies to hire foreign workers for specialized jobs that require specific technical expertise. And it's been a major pathway for skilled professionals, particularly from India, to come and work in the American tech sector. So think software engineers, data scientists, that sort of thing.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, this whole controversy started with an article in the Economic Times, which is an Indian newspaper, and it was about an American attorney who is publicly accusing an Indian CEO of some shady business practices.
Yes, and it's important to be clear, these are just allegations at this point, not proven facts, but the claims themselves are pretty attention-grabbing.
Totally. So what exactly is the attorney accusing the CEO of doing?
Okay, so the attorney claims that the CEO took over a company. This company had been acquired by a private equity firm and immediately started making some pretty drastic changes, starting with pushing out the company's founders.
Wow, the people who actually built the company from the ground up.
Exactly.
That's pretty bold.
It is. And then according to the attorney, the CEO started replacing key leadership positions with predominantly Indian professionals, basically creating a whole new executive team.
Okay, so kind of stacking the deck, so to speak. What happened to the existing employees?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. The attorney claims that the CEO instituted a company-wide 10% pay cut, saying it was temporary and due to the pandemic, and also froze all promotions.
Using the pandemic as a justification. I wonder how many companies actually did that.
It's definitely something worth considering, right? How that period of uncertainty might have been used to implement changes that wouldn't have flown in a more stable environment. But it doesn't stop there. The attorney also alleges that the CEO then laid off about 15% of the workforce and specifically targeted more experienced employees.
Those are probably making more money. I'm starting to see a pattern here.
And to make things even more controversial, the attorney claims that these layoffs coincided with the closure of a US-based office, and the work from that office was outsourced to India.
And that brings us right back to the H-1B visa.
Exactly. The implication being that the company might have used H-1B visas to bring in lower-cost workers from India to replace the American employees who were laid off.
It's like all the fears people have about globalization and outsourcing are playing out in this one story.
Right, and that's why it's resonated so strongly with people. It taps into this very real anxiety that many people feel about their jobs being shipped overseas.
And the attorney claims that all of this had a negative impact on the company's culture, client satisfaction, and basically increased the workload for everyone who was left.
Yeah, it paints a pretty stark picture of how these decisions can impact the people who work at a company, But of course, we're only hearing one side of the story.
Right, and that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating. This isn't just about one company or one CEO. The attorney's accusations went viral and triggered a wave of people sharing their own experiences, both good and bad, with Indian leadership in tech.
It definitely hit a nerve, and some of these personal stories are pretty eye-opening.
Absolutely. One example that comes to mind is this person on X, formerly known as Twitter, who said they worked for IBM and had to train their own replacement, who was based in India.
That's a powerful anecdote, and it gets right at the heart of those fears about globalization and job displacement. It's like the ultimate irony, having to prepare someone else to take your job.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how many other people have had similar experiences. And then there's this other anecdote that's been circulating about an Indian immigrant who bought a gas station here in the US and then fired all the existing employees and replaced them with family members.
That one raises a whole other set of questions about cultural differences in the workplace and the potential for those differences to clash with American norms.
Yeah, it gets into some murky territory about nepotism and fairness. And it's hard to know whether these anecdotes are indicative of a larger trend or if they're just isolated incidents.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to really unpack it, we need to move beyond individual stories and look at the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. What are some of the cultural and economic factors that are at play here? Because clearly there's more going on than just one CEO's actions.
Absolutely. One thing to consider is the sheer number of Indian professionals who are now working in the U.S. tech sector. India has become a major source of engineering and IT talent, and there are many Indian-born individuals who have risen to leadership positions in Silicon Valley and other tech hubs.
And a lot of that success can be attributed to the H-1B visa program, right?
Exactly. But of course, the program has also been criticized for potentially depressing wages for American tech workers and for creating a system where some companies might prioritize hiring foreign workers over equally qualified Americans.
So it's this balancing act between attracting global talent and protecting the interests of American workers. And this story has really brought that tension to the forefront.
Right, and it's a tension that's only going to increase as the tech industry continues to globalize.
And remember that we're not just talking about abstract economic forces here. We're talking about people's livelihoods and careers. These are real-world consequences for individuals and families.
You're absolutely right. This is a very human story. And it's one that deserves to be explored with sensitivity and nuance.
Well said. I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our podcast, from the initial allegations to the social media firestorm and the broader context of the H-1B visa program. But we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to unpack. We need to dig deeper into the cultural dynamics, the economic implications, and explore some potential solutions.
Stay tuned, everyone, because in the next part of our podcast, we're going to dive into all of that and more.
You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the emotions of the story, but I think it's important to step back and analyze the situation a bit more objectively.
Yeah, you're right. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on anecdotes, even if those anecdotes are really compelling. What are some of the things we need to keep in mind as we try to make sense of all this?
Well, for one thing, we need to be mindful of our own biases. We all have them, whether we realize it or not, and those biases can shape how we interpret information.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know I've caught myself making assumptions about this story, and I've had to check myself and say, okay, wait, am I letting my own biases color my perception here?
It's something we all have to be aware of, and when we're talking about something as sensitive as cultural differences, it's even more important to be cautious and avoid generalizations.
Absolutely. So how do we move beyond those knee-jerk reactions and have a more nuanced conversation about this?
I think it starts with recognizing that there are multiple perspectives on this issue, and that none of those perspectives are inherently wrong or right.
Okay, I like that. So instead of trying to figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in this situation, maybe we should be asking ourselves, what are the different ways of looking at this? And what can we learn from each of those perspectives?
Exactly. And I think one of the most valuable perspectives to consider is that of the H-1B visa holders themselves. We've talked a lot about the potential impact on American workers, but we haven't really talked about the experiences of the people who are coming to the U.S. to work through this program.
That's true. We've kind of left their voices out of the conversation. What are some of the things we need to understand about their perspective?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that these are highly skilled professionals who are coming to the U.S. to contribute their talents and build their careers. They're not just taking jobs, they're often creating jobs and driving innovation.
Many of them are leaving their families and home countries behind to pursue those opportunities.
Exactly. They're making significant sacrifices, and they're often facing a lot of uncertainty and pressure.
So maybe we need to be a little more empathetic to their situation and try to understand the challenges they're facing.
I think that's essential. And I also think we need to recognize that the H-1B is not some monolithic entity. It's a complex system with its own set of rules and regulations, and it's been subject to a lot of scrutiny and debate over the years.
Right, and there have been cases where companies have been accused of abusing the program, of using it to exploit foreign workers or undercut American wages.
Absolutely, and those cases are important to acknowledge and address, but it's also important to remember that those cases don't represent the whole story. There are many companies that are using the H-1B visa program responsibly and ethically, and there are many H-1B visa holders who are making valuable contributions to the American economy.
Okay, so how do we balance those competing narratives? How do we acknowledge the potential downsides of the program without demonizing the entire system or the people who are participating in it?
That's a tough question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But I do think it's important to have an open and honest conversation about the program, and to be willing to listen to all sides of the issue.
And to be willing to challenge our own assumptions. Because I think sometimes we get so caught up in our own anxieties and fears that we lose sight of the human beings who are at the heart of this issue.
Well said, and I think that's especially important when we're talking about cultural differences. It's so easy to fall into stereotypes and generalizations. But it's crucial to remember that culture is a complex and nuanced thing.
Right, and just because someone comes from a different culture doesn't mean they're going to behave in a certain way, or that they're going to share the same values as everyone else from that culture. We need to be careful about making those kinds of assumptions.
Absolutely, and we need to be open to learning about different cultures and perspectives, because the more we understand about other cultures, the less likely we are to make those kinds of sweeping judgments.
So maybe instead of focusing on the ways in which cultures are different, we should be looking for the common ground, the shared values that connect us as human beings.
I love that, because ultimately I think that's what it's all about. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and finding ways to bridge those cultural divides.
And maybe that starts with just being a little more curious about each other, a little more open to learning from each other's experiences.
I couldn't agree more. Curiosity is the key to understanding, and understanding is the key to empathy.
Okay, I'm feeling a lot more optimistic now. It feels like we're starting to get somewhere with this conversation.
Me too. I think we're making progress.
So where do we go from here? We've talked a lot about the problem. But what are some potential solutions? What can we do to create a more inclusive and equitable tech industry? One that values diversity and respects different cultures.
That's a great question, and it's one that we're going to tackle head-on in the next part of our podcast. We'll be exploring some concrete steps that individuals, companies, and policymakers can take to create a more just and equitable tech world for everyone.
I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I think it's going to be really insightful. Okay, so we've explored a lot of the complexities of this story, from the initial allegations, media firestorm, and the broader discussions about the H-1B visa program and cultural differences in the workplace. What I'm really curious about now is what we can actually do about all of this. You know, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of these issues, but I'm hoping we can come away from this conversation with some tangible ideas for how to create a more inclusive and equitable tech industry.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic goal, and I believe it's absolutely achievable. It starts with a recognition that this isn't just a problem for them to solve, whoever them might be. It's a challenge that requires a collective effort from individuals, companies, and policymakers alike. Each of us has a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable tech world.
I love that perspective. It's empowering to think that even small actions can make a difference. So let's break it down. Starting with individuals, what are some things that each of us can do within our own spheres of influence to promote inclusivity and equity in tech?
One of the most powerful things we can do is to cultivate a sense of curiosity and openness towards others, especially those whose backgrounds and experiences differ from our own. It's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives, engaging in respectful dialogue, and challenging our own assumptions.
That makes sense. It's about moving beyond our comfort zones and being willing to learn from people who might see the world differently than we do.
Exactly. And this applies not just to our personal interactions, but also to how we consume information. It's about being critical of the narratives we encounter, seeking out multiple perspectives, and being mindful of our own biases.
That's a really important point. We've talked a lot about biases in the context of this story and how they can shape our perceptions. So how can we become more aware of our own biases and mitigate their impact on our decisions and interactions?
Well, there are a lot of great resources available on unconscious bias, from books and articles to workshops and online courses. It's about educating ourselves on the different types of biases that exist, understanding how they manifest, and developing strategies to counteract them.
So it's about being proactive and intentional, about challenging those ingrained patterns of thinking. And it's about creating space for others to share their perspectives and experiences.
Absolutely. It's about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding. And when we encounter instances of bias or discrimination, whether it's directed at ourselves or others, it's about having the courage to speak up and challenge those behaviors.
Those are all great points for individuals. But what about companies? They obviously play a huge role in shaping the culture of the tech industry. What are some tangible steps they can take to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace?
One of the most critical areas is recruitment and hiring practices. Companies need to move beyond simply paying lip service to diversity and take concrete steps to ensure that their talent pipelines are truly diverse. This means casting a wider net, actively seeking out candidates from underrepresented groups, and removing barriers that might prevent those candidates from applying or succeeding.
That makes sense. It's about proactively creating opportunities for people who might not have traditionally had access to those opportunities. What are some specific strategies companies can use to achieve this?
There are a lot of innovative approaches out there. Blind recruitment processes, where identifying information is removed from resumes, can help reduce unconscious bias in the initial screening stages. Diversifying interview panels and using standardized interview questions can ensure a fairer and more objective assessment of candidates. And partnering with organizations that focus on promoting diversity in tech can help companies connect with a wider pool of qualified individuals.
Those are great examples. But it's not just about getting people in the door right. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued, respected,
You're
and
absolutely
supported.
right. Inclusivity is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. It requires creating a culture of belonging where everyone feels comfortable bringing their authentic selves to work. This includes providing opportunities for professional development and advancement, fostering mentorship programs, and celebrating the contributions of all employees.
It sounds like it's about moving beyond diversity as a metric and focusing on creating a truly inclusive environment where everyone can
Exactly,
thrive.
and this requires ongoing dialogue and feedback. Companies need to create safe spaces for employees to share their experiences, raise concerns, and provide input on how to improve. They need to be willing to listen, learn, and adapt.
So it's a continuous process of learning, growing, and evolving. What about policymakers? What role can they play in creating a more inclusive and equitable tech
Policymakers
landscape?
have a critical role in setting the framework for a just and equitable society. In the context of tech, this includes enacting and enforcing strong anti-discrimination laws, promoting pay equity, and providing incentives for companies to prioritize diversity and inclusion. They can also invest in education and training programs that make tech careers more accessible to people from all backgrounds.
So it's a multifaceted approach that involves creating a level playing field, supporting access to opportunities, and holding companies accountable for
Exactly,
their
and it
practices.
requires a collaborative effort. Individuals, companies, and policymakers all need to work together to create a tech industry that reflects the diversity of our society and provides opportunities for everyone to succeed.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, from the specifics of this viral story to broader discussions about globalization, cultural differences, and the future of work. What's really resonated with me is this idea that inclusivity is not just a nice to have. It's a necessity for a thriving tech industry and a just
Couldn't
society.
agree more. When we create an environment where everyone feels valued and respected, where everyone has the opportunity to contribute their talents and perspectives, we all benefit.
So as we wrap up this podcast, what's one key takeaway you want our listeners to ponder? What's one action they can take, no matter how small, to contribute to a more inclusive and equitable tech world?
I would say this: be curious, be open, be an ally, seek out diverse perspectives, challenge your own assumptions, and when you see something that's not right, speak up. Even small actions can make a difference.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a truly enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a complex and important issue. If you found this podcast inspiring, please like, share, and subscribe to the Curiosity Made Me podcast. Let's keep exploring, learning, and growing together, one powerful conversation at a time.
Excelling every task that you pursue. Curiosity fuels what you do.